Hello and welcome to Brickworks Bible Studies. Today we'll be continuing in our series on 1 Corinthians and we'll be looking at chapter 7. This chapter is the last in a block of chapters which are addressing the topic of the sin of sexual immorality. The first two chapters of this block, 5 and 6, Paul approaches the topic negatively, but then in chapter 7, which we're looking at today, he approaches it positively. So previously he's been telling us what not to do, what things are bad, whereas today he's looking at how to approach sexual morality from the stance of how to do it right and how to positively engage in sexual relationships. It is easy for us today to get caught up in the negatives of sexual immorality, about how it is wrong, about how various sins are abominations, how people need to do this, need to do that regarding sexual relationships and casting that judgment. And this, whilst maybe true, can lead us to actually forget that there is a good side to sexual relationships when done correctly, and that actually the act of sex isn't a bad thing. It isn't necessarily a sinful thing. It's just something that is reserved for the right time. Something which is reserved for marriage, but sometimes we get so caught up in the negative we can actually give off the wrong message and make people believe that actually sex in general is a bad thing. And so Paul in this chapter is looking at how to engage positively in our sexual relationships. And so in this block of chapters we can understand Paul is teaching us about sexual holiness. And today we are on a part of the holiness teaching that Paul is giving, which isn't about self-restraint, which he has just been teaching, but it's actually about how to have the correct relations for sexual activity to take place. So if we look at verses 1 to 7, Paul addresses concerns about refraining from sex within marriage. The concern raised in verse 1 translates directly to, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And in the world of scholarship and interpretation, there is quite a big debate as to what exactly this statement means. So some think that it refers to refraining from marriage, and if you have one of the old NIV Bibles, you'll read this statement that's about refraining from marriage. But if you read the modern NIV, you'll see that it's actually talking about something to do with general sexual relations, and that's one of the other theories as to what Paul is talking about. We should be refraining from sexual relations in general. And then one of the other main understandings is that it's referring to specific sexual relations, specific certain situations. And so this could be understood as meaning it is not good for a man to have sex with a woman for the sake of pleasure or to use a woman for sexual gratification. And this later sort of understanding, later paraphrase that I've just given you, potentially deals with the idea that the word touch, to touch a woman, which is used, is a euphemism which was common in ancient Greece. In the language ancient Greek, you would say the word touch, which was suggesting something that a man did to the object of his sexual desires and interests. And so it's possible that, and probably probable, that this is actually what Paul is referring to, is that people viewed sex as something for sexual gratification, using a woman for sexual gratification. As I say, this is something that's arguable, something that's debated in scholarship, and these are the three main arguments that are used. And so if we continue in Paul responding in verses 2 to 7 to this statement, and he basically says that sexual relations and acts are to be done within the marital context. This view is consistent with what is a wider biblical view that there are two types of sex, a sexual immorality and then a sex within marriage. It should be noted that these verses are sometimes used to suggest a right to demand love from another in the relationship. But I would suggest that these verses are actually speaking of a duty of the person to give love. So the husband has a duty to give love to his wife, not to demand love from his wife, and vice versa. Because Paul is not advocating an abusive relationship. It is possible that Paul in these verses is also responding to a culture where sexual relations in marriage were confined purely to procreation, and that commonly in the culture, sex for pleasure would take place in an extramarital sense. So you may have sex with a slave, you may have sex with a prostitute, or you may just have sex with somebody else for fun, for gratification. If you were to do that, you wouldn't do it with your wife, because your wife is for procreation. And so Paul may well actually be trying to respond to this practice that was common in the culture, and so almost being saying that actually this is what your husband, this is what your wife is for. So Paul is saying that sexual relations should all be confined within the marriage context. And so then Paul continues in verses 8 and 9 to teach to the unmarried and the widows. And we see here that actually Paul believes that being unmarried is the best place to be. In our society today, it is common for marriage to be heavily promoted as the best circumstance. And actually Paul explains later in this chapter why he believes otherwise. And so the culture at the time, similar to today, pressured people into marrying others, and Paul is trying to give people the freedom to choose what is right, and suggests that the celibate life is in fact the better option, but if you choose marriage life, then actually you're also okay to do so. Both are right, and Paul prefers celibacy. However, Paul does give a caveat in verse 9 to this view. If the person cannot control their sexual desires, then they should marry. This isn't just about acting on desire, but if you are having these temptations and impulses, which will make life difficult as temptations and impulses do, then you would be better getting married than staying single. So that's Paul's caveat to it being better being single is, well, actually, if you are tempted, then go and get married. And so then Paul continues into verses 10 to 16. And in these verses, Paul is probably addressing further questions from the people in Corinth about divorce. And Paul advocates that divorce should not be an option for the believer. The only time this changes is when the unbelieving partner chooses to leave the relationship. We're not talking necessarily about complex issues within marriage, but just a general approach to marriage is, according to Paul, the believer should not be getting divorced. And so the only time this should happen with a believer is when the unbelieving partner chooses to leave the relationship. And actually, if the partner does choose to leave a relationship, the one who is the believing partner shouldn't have a problem with that. They should be at peace. And there is a lot which can be said about these verses, such as about the sanctification of partners and children, which actually you may want to discuss in your groups if you desire to dig into that further, but it's not something I'm going to go into now. But one thing I do want us to note is verse 11, which says, if you do end up getting a divorce, do not get remarried unless it is due to reconciliation with your husband. The question would be here, actually, does this instruction contrast to verse 15? Because Paul says, if your unbelieving partner leaves you, then you are no longer bound. So is Paul saying, if you're in a believing relationship, then if you get divorced, stay divorced, but if you're in a relationship with someone who's an unbeliever who leaves, then actually you are free? Controversially, that maybe what it's suggesting, that this circumstance, actually remarriage is permissible, but that is something which may be controversial to believe in. But it's one of the big questions about what is Paul saying by you are no longer bound, and the fact that he has just said that, and he says again later actually, that if you get divorced, then do not remarry. And again, this may be something worthwhile discussing when in your group, is actually what do we think this is saying here. Let's grapple with what is potentially quite controversial and quite difficult to understand, and in the groups people may have different views, and it's good for us to be working out what is it we're actually believing from these verses. And so then we get into verses 17 to 24, which make up almost its own little block in this chapter. It almost feels like a bit of a diversion, but Paul is actually using it to further make a point. And so these verses are key to some of Paul's thoughts and ideas in this chapter. The idea of married believers staying married, the idea of single people remaining single, is kind of expanded in these verses in this block. There is a sense that Paul is suggesting that people shouldn't let common cultural prejudice govern their decisions on how to serve God. Remain in your situation as God has called you. You are responsible for how you live before God in your situation, and not to other humans. And so Paul in this block is almost explaining, well, this is why I believe what I believe about people who are married staying married and people who are single staying single. And so that's effectively what that block is doing. Again, we could go into fine details, but that's not for this video, but maybe it's something in the groups to discuss further. And then we come to this final block of Paul's teaching in verses 25 to 40. And so in verses 25 to 28, Paul seems to be addressing what is called the present crisis, which is commonly thought, well, there's actually two main thoughts really. Two main common ones is that it could be a large famine that was happening in the area around that time. But the other view is that it could be to do with the view in Corinth and across many churches of the very imminent second coming of Christ and the tribulations which they were facing at that time because of that. Either way, it seems that the instructions which come in these verses are an instruction based on an emergency measure. And Paul suggests that if you do get married, then you have done no wrong. But he is encouraging not getting married at this time. So there's a suggestion that because of this crisis going on, actually there are circumstances which are changing. People's maybe worried about getting married, maybe worried about procreating because of a crisis, bringing people into the world when maybe they shouldn't be. And what Paul is saying is actually, if you do get married, that's okay. You are free to make that choice. But at the same time, if you're not married, you're not betrothed to someone to get married, then actually don't get married at this time if that's possible. But he's very clear that actually you're not in the wrong if you do so. And then verses 29 to 35, Paul basically addresses that the believer needs to be living devoted to the Lord. He talks about time being short, which is thought to be referring to Christ's second coming. But as we just explained, it could be referring to something different. But Paul goes on to make future plans too. So he clearly wasn't sure how short this time which he is referring to actually is going to be. But he is saying that in all that we do, in all circumstances we find ourselves in, we need to concern ourselves with the Lord's affairs. So that's what's most important. We shouldn't be worrying about time being short, about the present crisis. And actually, we all came to God in whatever circumstances we were in when God called us. And actually, whatever that may be, let's concern ourselves with things of God, not things of this world. The things we have now are not forever, whereas God is forever. So the purposes of God are more important than the things of this world, which will pass away. And this reasoning that Paul's just given in these verses is why Paul thinks singleness is better to be in. It's a better circumstance than being married. It's because if you are single, you can fully focus on the Lord's purposes. And if you are married, this is not possible because you will have divided interests. You have to focus on your partner who you are married to and also onto God. So you've got split interests. But people who are single, according to Paul, are in a better position because they're in a better position to serve God and be devoted to him. And serving God for Paul is something that is of the highest honour. And so being able to wholly serve God is the best thing. But Paul is not saying that being married and having that divided interest is a bad thing. He's also saying that it is a good thing, particularly in the context of sexual purity, sexual holiness. If you're getting tempted, if you're getting impulses which lead to sexual immorality, then you should be married, as Paul has said earlier. That is a good thing and you are right to do so. But it does then mean you have different problems, new problems, and actually divided interests. And then finally, in verses 36 to 40, we come round full circle effectively to the similar concerns that we find at the start. If you find yourself under sexual temptation, then get married. But if you find yourself without this desire, then stay single. But if you get married, remain married. But when that partner dies, you are then free to remarry. And so this is the gist of what Paul is saying through this whole chapter. And as we kept coming back to, is if you're getting sexual temptation, to get married. If you're having sexual temptations, then that's reserved for the place of marriage. And in this context, people were going outside of marriage to fulfill their sexual desires, but actually that is for within marriage. And there is a question which is raised in one sense of around sex or procreation. One common view even today is sex and marriage is for procreation. But what Paul seems to suggest is actually part of marriage is actually about dealing with sexual desire, sexual temptation, and that should be for your husband and for your wife. And that's where you fulfill those things. And so if you're in a relationship and those temptations are there, get married. If you're married, have it with your partner. And Paul earlier in the chapter says that only for a agreed time should you withhold that from each other. And even then, Paul seems almost reluctant to offer that. But only if you agree to not be engaging together in that should it be withheld from each other. And so sex in marriage is both for fulfilling desire and also for fulfilling procreation. We shouldn't be separating that out, because that's what was happening in Corinth and causing very questionable sexual relationships and leading to high-end sexual immorality, where people were sleeping with people who were not their wife, but then also neglecting their wife for only when they wanted to have sex for making children. So some questions for us to consider are, what are your thoughts on this passage? Does it confuse you? Because it's quite a confusing passage. Does it challenge your worldview? Is it different to what you believed was right? So what are your thoughts on this passage? How does it challenge you? Next question, it would be, what circumstances did God call you? So what circumstances, what situation were you in when God called you to be a Christian? This can be about being single, being married, but it could be other circumstances. Obviously we're not slaves like in the passage, but it could be, the workplace you were maybe in. It could be, not the workplace. You might have other places which you are, but what circumstances were you in when God called you? And then finally, what struggles does this passage bring to the surface for you? What struggles might you have? Because this passage is very direct in places, very challenging in places. So what struggles are brought to the surface when you read this chapter?